So we looked at two different market structures that were polar opposites, opposite end of the spectrum. They're the extremes. One, perfect competition, where we had lots and lots of firms producing, all producing products that were perfect substitutes for one another, and there was free entry and free exit. We looked at monopoly, where there was only one producer producing an output that was unique with no close substitutes, and where entry was basically prohibited for different possible reasons. Now we're going to look at a couple of market structures that are more in the middle, things that are more realistic, more like real life, more like the markets in which we participate. A few things are purely competitive and or purely pure monopolies. So we're going to think about the characteristics of monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And we'll talk about how those economic profits can persist in the long run, potentially. And we'll mention some examples of what we call non-price competition. We'll talk about what a cartel is, and talk about maybe the pros and cons, or the outcomes in the four different market structures. So monopolistic competition is kind of closer to pure competition than it is to monopoly. So we have many sellers, so a large number, so that each is small relative to the market. They might vary in size and the number of product lines that they offer. They offer differentiated products, so there's not a single market price here. Each firm has a little bit of monopoly power. They differentiate their product. I think about monopolistic competition. It makes me think about something like shoes. So there are lots of different shoe producers. There are lots of different kinds of shoes, men's shoes and ladies' shoes, and within men's shoes there are kind of dress and then casual and athletic shoes. But if we think about only athletic shoes, there are shoes that are for cross-training, baseball, basketball, running. If we think about within running shoes, there are many different brands of different producers that produce different brands of running shoes. And even within a particular company like New Balance or Nike, even if we're talking about specifically running shoes, if you were to look at their websites, you would see there's big various alternatives. I personally run in New Balances, so if you look at New Balance's website, you'll see that they offer many kinds of running shoes that are actually for running, and that the prices can go from $20, $30 or $40 all the way up to $130 for these different models. And so there's lots of variation in the products that are sold in a monopolistically competitive market. So there's easy entry and exit. It's not exactly free, but it's not prohibited. If we think about that, it wasn't too long ago that there was no company called Under Armour that now produces running shoes, that is a recent entrant into the running shoe market, and that there are many specialty brands. If you were looking for running shoes, there are many brands and product lines from which to choose. So you have many sellers, differentiated products, and easy entry and exit. In monopolistic competition, we see a lot of advertising. They're trying to differentiate their product. And the idea behind advertising and marketing in this case is to influence. Remember, we talked about our themes that determined where the demand curve was. That taste and preferences were one of those things. So that if we can increase the preference or taste for our output, that's going to shift our demand curve out to the right, which leads to a higher market price and makes our firm better off. So, advertising, example of non-price competition, offering your shoes in a variety of sizes and widths and colors and different designs. These are all types of non-price competition that we hope is going to affect consumers' demand. When I say we, I guess I'm thinking from the seller's perspective. In the long run, monopolistically competitive firms are going to be kind of like the perfectly competitive firms, in that when a new product gets introduced, if that product earns a positive economic profit, then we expect other firms, because there is free entry, to come in and compete with those kinds of output. So we see a new technology be introduced. When there is free entry, we see lots of other firms enter into that market and compete the price down. We've been talking about running shoes, but if we think about something like big screen LCD TVs, when it's a new technology, something comes out, that firm is probably earning above normal profits, and then ultimately we see all this competition come in and offer different kinds of features for the television, and what we ultimately see is that the prices get competed down, so that eventually firms that are selling that particular product are earning what we identified as normal profits on those products in the long run. So that's kind of the idea that monopolistic competition is good for consumers, because ultimately we get prices competed down because there's free entry. Also, we get this great deal of variety from the non-price competition, from firms competing for consumers' dollars. So they compete for the dollars, which pushes the price down, but it also results in all this innovation. We're trying to get you to buy our stuff because it is better. So we get higher quality and more variation in output. So monopolistic competition seems to be something that is good for consumers. Oligopoly is one of those that's the market structure that's in the middle, that leans more towards monopoly, and that's because there are only a few sellers. We have a few sellers who are mutually interdependent upon each other. So their pricing and quantity decisions depend a great deal upon what their competitors do. These firms may offer a product that is differentiated, or it could be a homogeneous product. We think about maybe automobiles being an oligopoly type industry. There are a handful of firms that produce and sell automobiles in the United States, but there is a great deal of variety among automobiles, while there are also a handful of firms who sell gasoline, that refine oil into gasoline and sell it in the United States. And they may try to say that has some kind of something that makes it better or preferable to the competition, but by and large we think of gasoline as being homogeneous, pretty reasonable substitutes for Shell oil versus Exxon oil, so forth. There may be there are going to be some barriers to entry into this market, which makes it similar to monopoly in this respect, that there are few sellers because it is hard to get into the industry for whatever reason. We see non-price competition and oligopoly, this product differentiation that we talked about with monopolistic competition, which is something that we don't see with monopoly or perfect competition, right? This product differentiation where we're trying to affect preferences or trying to cater to a particular preference of groups of consumers. There is the danger, though, that when there are only a few sellers when there are only a handful of sellers, that they can collude. And this collusive behavior will be when the firms get together and say, instead of competing with one another, let's act like a monopoly. So instead of increasing our output and competing our price downward, we could get together and agree to split the market, earn above normal profits, and keep our prices high. In effect, we would have the firms who should be competing, which we said is better off for consumers. This collusive behavior means that they are working together to act like a monopoly. We said that compared to competition, the monopolist gains at the expense of consumers. So John Nash, the mathematician at Princeton, is famous for his work in game theory. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize in economics because his models were used in economics. He was not necessarily thinking about economics when he developed this field, or when he kind of came up with this field that's known as game theory. Game theory gives us a framework for analyzing mutually interdependent actions. So we have a situation where we have two competitors whose pricing and quantity decisions are their own, but their profits, the outcome, is determined not only by their own pricing and quantity decisions, but by the pricing and quantity decisions of the other firms in the industry, more so than in any other industry. So the original game in game theory was called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, you should read about it in detail in your text, but the gist of it is that we have a conflict between the incentives of the individual and the incentives of the group. That is, the group would be better off doing one thing, but each individual is better off by doing another thing, so that the individuals often deviate from what's best from the group to what's best for them, and so that it winds up with the group being worse off as a whole. So if we look at this example that we have in your textbook, is an application of the prisoner's dilemma to these economic decisions. And that is, we have two airlines who are competing with one another, or two airlines that are serving the same route, say from various airports. And they have to choose between what looks like that monopoly price, the high price, and the competitive price, the low price. If you remember from our, if you want to look back to the monopoly versus competition thing that we did in Chapter 8, we say that they have to choose between charging a high price and a low price, where the low price is effectively competing against one another, and the high price is colluding and acting like a monopoly. And so if we look at American Airlines and U.S. Airways options between choosing a high price and a low price, we can see that the joint profits of the firm are biggest in that rectangle that's marked A, where U.S. Air charges a high price and American charges a high price as well. So if they collude and act like a monopoly, they will share $16 billion, getting $8 billion each. However, U.S. Airways, from their perspective, if American charges a high price and they undercut their price, charging a low price, U.S. Air stands to gain $2 billion for a total of $10 billion in profits, while American Airlines will lose their profit and incur a $2 billion loss. So it's in U.S. Airways' best interest to offer the low price if they believe that American Airlines is going to be offering a high price. So we can think of U.S. Airways as choosing the column, and if they think that American is choosing high, then then U.S. Airways is choosing between 8 and 10, and they tend to want to go for this 10 over here. If they believe that American is going to charge a low price, then they have the choice between charging a high price and incurring a loss, or charging a low price and earning a $5 billion profit. Then we can say U.S. Airways has it in their best interest to charge a low price. You see this 5 and this 10. It's in their best interest to charge a low price no matter what they think American Airlines is going to do. So American Airlines chooses the row and U.S. Airways chooses the column. So if they choose this row, U.S. Air should choose a low fare, receiving the 10 billion. If American chooses a low price, then U.S. Air should choose the low price, earning a profit of 5 billion. So even though the total profits in the industry would be better with both firms charging a high price, colluding and acting like a monopoly, U.S. Airways sees it in their own individual best interest to charge a low price, therefore kind of defecting from the collusive agreement. American has an identical incentive structure. They would be better off as a group here, but their American's incentive is to charge a low price. So each of the airlines would be better off going if they colluded and went for the 8. But since each of the individual airlines has the incentive to go for the 10 here and go for the 10 here, that is, each of them charging a low price, they wind up in cell D here, where each earns $5 billion profit. So when each firm follows their own self-interest, each firm ends up with $5 billion instead of $8 billion in this case. So this is an application of game theory, the prisoner's dilemma, to a high price, low price, collusion versus competition outcome. That's the end of section 2. Make sure you've completed all your homeworks, and you'll have a discussion and an exam coming up soon. Thanks.